Check, check, check. Party people, the place to be. Jackie Dragon and Infinite Harmony. Welcome back to the Infinite Harmony podcast. I'm your host, Jackie Dragon, and today we are embarking on a journey woven of many intricate overlapping ideas that we've talked about in this podcast. This might be my boldest attempt yet at sharing someone's body of work in relationship to the harmonic road we are walking together. Over the next few podcasts, we will be taking a look at Christopher Alexander's Magnum Opus, The Nature of Order, a volume of work covered in 4 books that clocks in at just over 2,100 pages. Thankfully for me, sadly for you, many of the pages depict photographs of various examples of the ideas and concepts through existing architecture that Alexander is conveying to his readers. I found the dive into his work a deeply affirming journey into the animistic nature of reality and was blown away at some of his observations, which I'm excited to share. What drew me to Alexander's work was one of his earlier works, A Pattern Language. I'd heard of this book through various permaculture circles, and by those who spoke of it, I was promised deep insight into the universal patterns of building and planning just about everything, from a bedroom to an entire village. I eventually found a copy, and to be honest, I had a pretty hard time understanding what the guy was talking about. But there was an underlying thread, a heartstring that vibrated within me that could feel that the message was there. But the timing for me it wasn't right. Just the title of the book, A Pattern Language, felt like a key to a door I had yet to find. Perhaps I was simply uninitiated to his school of thinking and would have to wait for the right time to enter the door. I can't say I even remember how I discovered the existence of The Nature of Order. But what I do know is there's no ordering these books on Amazon. At the time, I could only find and order the books through a publisher following this series of strange links and emails. It felt like this initiatory process to a secret school, which honestly was kind of cool. When they arrived, it'd be another 3 years before I was able to move beyond book 1 because, well, frankly, it was still over my head. But for those of you that know me personally, I'm no polymath, and sometimes it takes me a while to catch on. Well, I've caught on. All this to say that it's been a long time coming, and I'm happy to share the work with those of you listening. So here we go. It's not a leap to say that architecture has lost something vital. Architecture of the medieval era, the Renaissance, even the early architecture of some of the older cities of America, such as New York, Boston, they have this breath of life within them that is distinct. It elicits a feeling. Even in Chicago, when I was growing up, there was this distinct difference in the buildings erected in the early 1900s and the ones built in the last 20 years. Architecture today has a cookie-cutter quality to it that is almost impossible to circumvent, unless you're in the 1% and are willing to spend substantially on rare materials and master craftsmanship. For quite some time, I've harbored the belief that the rise of manufactured homes signaled the slow death of the neighborhood. In this modern age, we are surrounded by structures built from cheap, easily mass-produced materials. Homes that feel as hollow and disposable as the methods used to create them. The marriage of art and function, once central to building, has been ruthlessly sacrificed at the altar of speed and efficiency. Consider what went into the enduring marvels of human ingenuity, like Notre Dame Cathedral, whose soaring spires and intricate stonework took nearly 2 centuries to bring into life. The Hagia Sophia, a monument to both spiritual devotion and architectural brilliance. This also unfolded across 200 years of labor and vision. Or consider the Basilica de la Sagrada Familia, this ever-evolving symphony of stone and sky, which has been under construction since the late 1800s and stands unfinished to this day. In each of these buildings, every chisel mark is a testament to the patience and reverence for the craft of building. Even the Taj Mahal required 22 years to rise, its gleaming domes and delicate inlays speaking of a love so profound it defies time itself. These structures are more than just buildings. They are the embodiment of dreams, of entire civilizations and national icons that endure because they were made with the weight of meaning pressed into every stone. built to last 1,000 years. In stark contrast, most modern houses seem to exist merely to fulfill a function, erected in the briefest window of time and with the leanest of investments. Across the United States, generic apartment complexes and condominiums spring up like weeds, their sterile uniformity draining character from city blocks as though some architectural vampire were at work. These buildings do not invite admiration or contemplation. They stand merely as placeholders, shells of convenience, rather than vessels of beauty or belonging. There's an old saying among builders that you can build something with 2 out of 3 characteristics: cheap, fast, or well done. It seems that most things are done cheap and fast. This topic is especially pertinent to me because as we speak, I'm building a house. It's a modest building at about 750 square feet, and aside from the occasional help of a few very good friends, I'm building it alone. Fast is a priority for me because I don't have the luxury of taking 20 years to build this masterpiece. But even taking a reasonable amount of time, the vision of beauty I desire, the materials I yearn to build with, are well beyond my means. So I settle often when it comes to the form. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the price of oak these days, or most hardwoods. Stone, marble, copper. These things are mostly for the wealthy now. For years, one of my favorite pastimes for tuning myself to the metaphysical background of my existence was to walk the streets of Chicago with my best friend and find unique and beautiful swaths of architecture throughout the city. Certain houses, sometimes whole streets, had a feeling to them, this ineffable quality of art and aliveness that made me love the city, made me love architecture. Over the years, these old buildings were torn down to make way for more efficient, square-foot optimized structures. Watching these new buildings go up in Chicago and change the lived quality of my neighborhood felt akin to the clear-cutting of the Amazon, but in my own backyard. Sadly, what we've lost is not just aesthetic splendor, but a sense of rootedness, of community woven into stone and wood, the culture of a neighborhood, the culture of a city through its architecture. A home was once a statement of permanence, of care, and of deep connection to the land and its people. It had the character of those that lived in it. Now it feels, though, as if we're all just passing through, transient occupants and structures designed to endure no longer than the trends that shape them. In our rush to build quickly and cheaply, we have forsaken the slow, deliberate art of creating spaces that nourish the soul and stand as legacies for those yet to come. And in our own current paradigm of relocating, upsizing, downsizing, or the spawn of the Dark One himself, flipping houses, it's a miracle we can ever experience home. I don't know about you, but most of my friends, myself included, have had their childhood homes sold so our parents could relocate to Florida or Arizona or get a condo because, well, why pay the property taxes on 3 empty rooms? There's a lot to say about the places we live and the places we call home, how and why they're built, and how they do or don't give meaning to our lives. It wasn't until I opened Book 1 of The Nature of Order, titled The Phenomenon of Life, that I had language to put to the feelings I've been expressing thus far. Alexander sets out almost immediately to empirically prove through observation that the built world around us is in fact alive. Now, attempting to explain the nature of order is pretty ambitious. It's a task humans have set out to accomplish since the dawn of abstract thinking. You could say that humans are order-making machines. I'm not talking about my own tendency to build stick figures out of toothpicks here. I'm talking about the deep desire we have as a species to understand how everything works. I'm talking about that deep desire to organize the world both physically and abstractly. If one were to take the time to tune in, we can feel the nature of order in things. There's a rhythm to life, to the seasons, to the spawning of the salmon, the path of the river, the balance of an ecosystem, the inevitability of a forest fire or a hurricane, The natural order seems neither predictable nor effable, and yet we can feel its existence. A more effable order can be found in physics, as we discovered the rather abstract yet clearly experienced law of thermodynamics, of gravity, of atomic structure. Man-made order, on the other hand, comes across more often like an attempt to control, to predict, which in some sense defies the natural order of things. Nevertheless, Alexander attempts to qualify a sense of order that would be useful to architects based on what he feels represents order in the universe. He realizes quickly that the mechanical order of the universe provided by the discipline of physics is not what he was looking for. Humans have done quite well with the mechanical nature of order and have engineered wondrous marvels, Eiffel Tower, cell phones. But what, he asks, is the order that pervades the leaf of a tree, or the mountain, or the cherry blossoms in the fall? The very order that lends to unparalleled beauty and belonging. The type of order that suggests that all that exists in this universe is teeming with aliveness. There's nothing mechanical, he says, about a handmade tea bowl that houses the tea perfectly, or a Beethoven symphony. Instead, there is an aliveness to it, a living quality that permeates its existence. How, he asks, do we build architecture that is alive? And why have we strayed so far in the last 50 years? Let me tell you a story. When I stumbled across Division Street and looked at Cabrini Green in Chicago for the first time, which thankfully no longer exists, I was blown away. Everything about this infamous public housing project felt wrong. It looked like a prison. It stood out from everything else around it, and it almost pushed the life out of anything that got near it. Even the few trees on the lot seemed void of life and desolate. And when I say it looked like a prison, I mean it. Walkways to apartments were enclosed in chain-link fences. Lawns had been paved over. The burnt-out apartments were never fixed, only abandoned, until half the building was probably squatters. And somehow people were still trying to live there. The place was a mere shadow of a tenement at the edge of its own abyss. And yet, at its peak, it was home to over 15,000 people and lasted 40 years. The mechanistic high-rises built to maximize capacity and minimize, well, just about everything, was a horrific failure and eventually demolished. Critics will cite cheap building methods, tight budgets, and sadly a lack of empathy as the cause of failure. But if you ever wondered what happens when humans place efficiency and cost over the right of a worthy human life, Cabrini Green was it. Thankfully, it was abandoned, torn down. I'm not going to get into the socioeconomic politics of what happened to the people living there, but all I can say is it's a good thing that nobody will ever live there again. You see, at some point, this mechanization of all things made for the sake of efficiency, from our housing to all kinds of daily objects, it begins the formation of a built world which is increasingly lifeless. You hear it all the time now. Everything is built with planned obsolescence. Nothing is built to last. Old homes, often called craftsmen's, have this uniqueness to them. A new home looks like every other home built alongside of it. This takes us back to Karst and his difference between the garden and the machine from our earlier podcast. If you remember, the machine is driven by external forces, whereas the garden is driven by an internal force. For Alexander, this internal force, what he calls aliveness, is what he will conjure into being throughout his architecture and throughout his career and throughout these books. But first he asks, how did we become so mechanized in our thinking? How did we get to strip malls and high-rise condos and manufactured homes? Alexander offers one suggestion that I've heard many times, which led to the birth of this overly reductionist and lifeless world that not only we're building, but we're thinking in. The separation between man and his environment. the separation of subject and object. Descartes. Descartes is a man many believe spun the golden thread of separation from man and nature, a man who unknowingly bled animism from the world, the father of modern science. He was the beginning of breaking things down into individual components, which led to a disregard of the whole and the importance of coherence. For Alexander, this realization led to two things. First was the invalidation of the inner experience as something that can be deemed empirical. In other words, the validity of our own personal experiences and feelings. The second was the loss of value intrinsic to the natural world. What I mean by that is, how does one place value on a 2,000-year-old redwood tree and its importance in an ecosystem? If one looks solely from a mechanistic point of view, the value is calculated by how many cubic feet of lumber it's worth. And frankly, that's just fucked. Now we can go deeper and follow the golden thread to how neoliberalism as a whole, how our modern society has just completely reduced the value of the natural world, how it's abandoned morality, and in some ways, abandoned spirit, abandoned God. There is, of course, as always, a greater symptom here. But for now, let's focus on Alexander and his observations. To Alexander, the quality of a scientific question often falls flat in its reductive logic and is void of essence. To Alexander, a better question to ask is one that considers all the living factors of a choice, specifically considering who it will affect, the qualities of beauty it will impart, the flow and direction of energy, and most importantly, what answer has more or less life. Now, these sound like deeply subjective questions, but Alexander would go on to argue that no, they're not entirely subjective. Humans, especially ones from similar cultures and upbringings, all intuitively know the answers to these questions and will often agree. But regardless, questions about how not only our living and communal spaces are structured, but the structure of society itself are meant to be felt together, specifically by those who will live in the space or live in the society. After all, don't you live at home? Do you have a living room? Do you live in a city? If that's the case, aren't these places that are lived in alive in their own right? Or at least built to house life? Shedding mechanistic thought means that energy efficiency, cost of materials, spanning distances, all of these are just part of a process of design that should never be the primary concern. To Alexander, beauty, belonging, human interaction, and relationship to everything that's non-human, these are the paramount qualities, the first principles. To Alexander, the biggest question is a space alive? He sets out to do for architecture what Forrest Landry sets out to do for ethics in the book An Immanent Metaphysics, which is to bring a new understanding to science, one that takes into account the subjective qualities of experience and attempts to order them into a universal pattern that we can all agree upon. I'm hearing these threads of this idea spoken in many places, that we have to acknowledge that both physicalism and idealism are integral parts of existence. Another way of saying it is that objective reality and subjective experience are both essential to understanding the universe and both quantifiable. Lex Friedman recently interviewed Adam Frank, an American physicist, astronomer, and writer. In the interview, Friedman asks, what is the most important question we can ask ourselves as humans? And Frank responds just as Alexander did. The most important question is, what is life? Frank says, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says, quote, really this question of what is life is the most important philosophical question beyond science. It's the verb, to be, and it asks, what is being? This is what Stephen Hawking said when he talked about what puts the fire in the equations. The fire is this presence of life, and this is where it touches the sacred, the spiritual. So this question of life, what makes life as a physical system so different is because this is where being appears. Being doesn't appear out there. The only place being ever appears to any of us is in the experience of self. I can do this kind of projection of myself into the third person and see outside of myself, but nobody ever truly has the God's eye view. That's a story we all tell. End quote. What Frank is saying here is that our point of view is all we have. So in a sense, science can't happen without the subjective. And the subjective is crucial to understanding the nature of the universe.
Oh, I get it. It's kind of like pizza. The dough baked in the oven is the universal pattern, but beyond that, everything's subjective, right? I mean, red sauce, white sauce, pepperoni, mushrooms, pesto. I mean, we can all agree that throwing a bunch of stuff on dough qualifies as a pizza, but no one in their right mind would attempt to standardize anything beyond that. A pizza, and what constitutes a good pizza, is probably one of the most subjective experiences we can have. Ain't that right, Johnny? Yeah, boss. Dead nuts. But I mean, you know, everyone agrees that a good pizza is really good, right? Exactly. That's my point.
And now back to our regularly scheduled program.
Alexander's view of order is, quote, even-handed with regard to ornament and function. Order is profoundly functional and profoundly ornamental. We learn to see that while they seem different, they are really only aspects of a single kind of order, end quote. Dough and toppings, man. They're both profoundly necessary. Order can be a deeply personal thing. But again, we can all agree that a building is only worth building if it doesn't fall on us. But aside from that, it can be whatever you want it to be. Ultimately, Alexander's goal as an architect is to design a building that is alive. And because of that aliveness, the humans inhabiting them also feel more alive. Their well-being flourishes. They feel like they belong. So build something that's alive. Well, what does that even mean? What is it to be alive? An even more existential question than what is the nature of order? What is it to be alive? And yet, it is here that Alexander begins to breathe life into our things and imbue the spirit of the animist into architecture to help us feel what I believe we intrinsically all know, that entities we call objects, that we call things, are in fact alive. Can you get the sense of it? The aliveness of things? That's what we're seeking. The sense of it. The depth of aliveness in any given moment. This is the awareness we need to discover how to step up to what Alexander calls the task of making ordinary life in things. Like Mother Gaia herself, we yearn to experience the aliveness of our environment, and in this case, our built world. So let's follow Christopher Alexander's golden thread down a wild rabbit hole of newfound awareness and discover the nature of order. Today, on the Infinite Harmony podcast.
Infinite flavors, flavors of color, colors of being. Infinite flavors, flavors of color, colors of being, being together.
To arrive at the place of truly understanding the nature of aliveness, We need what Alexander calls a broader and more adequate definition of life, something that involves degrees of aliveness. And how we measure those degrees of awareness is by a feeling, an awareness. It's not a static thing. For anyone who's owned a car for a long time, or a motorcycle, or a leather jacket, the sense of aliveness changes over time. Our relationship to the things create a sense of aliveness. Some things are intensely alive. An actual tiger, for instance, if seen and felt in the wild, would emit a profound sense of aliveness in just about anyone. And yet, a stuffed animal version of that same tiger might feel deeply alive to a young boy who considers the stuffed tiger his best friend. So, another example, consider a piece of Home Depot 2x4. Now juxtapose that with a well-oiled driftwood table you might see, or rough-sawn cedar. I realize I'm building a house right now and maybe 3 people out there just got that reference, but I don't know. Think of an old Victorian house filled with antique furniture versus an IKEA apartment. Or think of the fallen logs you might climb in a forest versus a concrete playground. Or, as Alexander might actually lay out in one of his examples, ask yourself which is more alive. The plastic garbage can everyone has in their kitchen nowadays? Or one of those old metal trash cans, like the one Oscar the Grouch lives in? Can you feel the quality of aliveness in these different things? Can you feel the essence of the thing? Think of the aliveness that nature exudes. Is the wind alive? The sea? The waves crashing upon the shore? All things come from nature, even plastic. And yet there are degrees of aliveness. Let's take a moment. Take yourself back to childhood. Think of one of the most alive places you can remember. A pond, a grove of trees, an old abandoned house in your neighborhood, your grandfather's study, your own backyard perhaps, a riverbank, the local candy store. Now, think of a Walmart parking lot, or a suburban strip mall, or a monocropped cornfield. Can you get the sense of it? The aliveness of things? In his first book, Christopher Alexander starts to outline the qualities of what makes something feel alive. It reminds me of the Japanese term wabi-sabi, which roughly translates to a beauty found in imperfections and impermanence. I've always found that creations that endure are the ones that are built to age well. What is it about a 1974 truck that ages so well? What is it about a Ferrari Testarossa in 2024 that looks so obnoxious? Do you ever see anyone driving an old rusted Ferrari? No, they're not built to age. Their life is fleeting. Aliveness is a little rough around the edges. It has a sense of being lived in. Again, like a well-worn pair of jeans, aliveness fits well. It creates a sense of familiarity. It's the well-worn faces of our grandparents. It's their rocking chair on the front porch, the tattered edge of your favorite frayed blanket, a worn leather vest, the undying relationship with your dog, your first guitar, practically any appliance built before 1960. Alexander asks us to tune into the truth of these feelings of aliveness, the similarity of ease and welcome that these feelings bring. Then he says, let us build the world in this way, so that everywhere we walk, drive, everywhere we lie our heads, fills us with the same sense of beauty and aliveness we feel at our best. It's here in Book 1 that Alexander begins to empirically study aliveness. He places 2 different images, side by side, of similar scenes but different in their degree of life. Everything from slums and riverbanks to winding roads. He compares one tattered barn to the next, one image to another, one teacup to another teacup, one rug to another rug. And in each, he asks, quite frankly, which picture feels more alive. According to his own experiments, we can mostly agree on what feels more alive. About 80% of people could agree on the image. According to Alexander, we have a fundamental power to make these distinctions, and ultimately this measurement of life quality has a scientific method. Thus, Alexander has a hypothesis that he sets out to prove. He says, quote, "What we call life is a general condition which exists to some degree or another in the very part of space, brick, stone, grass, river, painting, building, daffodil, human being, forest, city, and further. The key to this idea is that every part of space, every connected region of space, small or large, has some degree of life, and that this degree of life is well defined, objectively existing, and measurable." End quote.
What the fuck is this guy talking about? Okay, so here's the thing, boss. I think it's kind of like I don't know. It's like your mama's pasta sauce versus a jar of ragu. Like even a schmuck is gonna know what the better pasta sauce is, right? Like it doesn't take rocket science here. Like you sit anybody down, they eat your mama's pasta sauce, or they eat a little bit of ragu out of a jar, or prego, whatever. They're gonna know. I think that's what he means. Oh, okay, I think I know what he's getting at here. It's kind of like a Cadillac built, I don't know, anytime before 1980 versus like those things they called Cadillacs in the 1980s and 90s. It's just, it wasn't a Cadillac. There was just something wrong with it, right? Like, the other ones were just better. But, I mean, would anybody disagree with that?
Now from here, book one, the phenomenon of life starts to take on a technical tone. The joy of the journey is that this technical point of view really blurs the lines between the reductive science and the animist. It's a weaving of golden threads. It kind of reminds me of Capra and the Tao of Physics, this merging of quantum physics with Eastern philosophy. These books, they're asking us to consider the experiential phenomenon of aliveness and order as something intrinsic to the entire universe. Early in the book, Alexander introduces the concept of wholeness and the theory of centers. He begins by asking, what is wholeness? And how is it that we define such a thing? In his observation, this is not easy, as our propensity to break everything into parts is what can lead to a separation of aliveness if we're not careful. This goes back to Descartes and the reductive science. He uses the example of a pond. It's easy to look at a pond and think, that's a pond. But what constitutes the whole pond? Is the saturated mud below the pond a part of the whole? Are the reeds growing in the pond a part of it? The insects flying above it? That tree branch that's half in the pond and half on the ground? What constitutes the pond? The deeper question an animist would ask is, where does the pond end and the not pond begin? The physicist would point out the boundary we perceive as humans is only a perception. Atomically, there is no boundary. We are all pond.
Do not try and bend the spoon. That's impossible. Instead, only try to realize the truth.
What truth?
There is no spoon.
There is no spoon?
Then you'll see that it is not the spoon that bends, it is only yourself.
There is no pond, and yet we perceive boundaries. We categorize. We break everything down into parts. So how do we capture wholeness and aliveness in the built world? To Alexander, It's through the theory of centers, which is one of the fundamental ideas of his books. Alexander looks at wholeness through a system of centers, and it is the centers and their arrangement that give us a sense of the whole. Some centers themselves are a whole and have centers within, depending on where we place our attention. That which is easy to see, easy to name, has strength. Strong centers, he says, control the real behavior of the thing, the life which develops there, the real human events which happen, and the feelings people have about living there. And together, with the people occupying these spaces, the centers make up the whole. When it comes to architecture, the culture of the people become a living center of the whole. The degrees of life we experience come from the wholeness. Our desire to see this wholeness for what it truly is one of the greatest of golden threads, reaching back into the nature of consciousness and reality. So what does he mean by this theory of centers, and how some centers themselves are whole and have centers within? Well, take a house, right? It's a whole thing. It itself is a center, right? Your house on the block definitely feels like a center of the block. But then within the house, there are different rooms, right? Living room, kitchen. One of those might feel very much like a center. When you're in it, you are in the kitchen, and it is the center. Yet within that kitchen are various other centers. Actually, I'd like to use the example of a living room. Imagine a living room built in a way that the strongest center is a coffee table. It's made of exquisite oak. It sits literally in the center of the room, surrounded by comfortable chairs and couches with nothing on it but coasters for coffee or tea. Everyone sits in the living room and talks and drinks coffee and shares cookies. It's a great living room with a strong center that brings it to life. Your neighbors come by once a week for tea, and it's very pleasant. Now imagine the owner of the living room buys an 80-inch flat-screen TV and mounts it on the wall and turns all the chairs towards it, puts some TV guides and controllers on the table. Dad, did he just say TV guide? What the hell's a TV guide? Now in this new arrangement, is the coffee table still a strong center? Or has the TV become the center? What has it done to the whole living room, the whole of the house, the whole of the family? Now every time your neighbor stops by, you're watching a show. Sometimes maybe you don't even answer the door. Or sometimes instead of good conversation and coffee, you just zone out and watch TV with your friends. So, anytime you're constructing a home, a shed, a public parklet, or courtyard, it begins with creating these strong centers. These centers bring the whole to life. Alexander says, quote, "The conjuring trick is something akin to the trick of making Frankenstein. We take dead matter, rooted only in space, endowed with the rules governing the interaction of centers, and we raise it to life." End quote. His point is that the degree of life we experience very much comes from the interaction and cooperation of centers. That dynamic interactions and mutual benefit of centers are the drivers of life. Cooperation, interaction, dynamic interplay, coherence. These all lead to a greater degree of experienced aliveness. It's like, imagine how the indigenous felt. Was a river one of their centers? The plains where the buffalo roamed? The village? The question is, how do the spaces that we interact with affect us? And how in turn do we affect the spaces we interact with? One of his most interesting observations is that centers do affect each other. They shape each other and bring each other to life, or in some instances take away from it. I think this has to do with natural symmetry, perhaps the sacred geometrical nature of our universe, though Alexander doesn't quite say it like that. What I mean is at one point in my life, I thought I might be an illustrator. I made a handful of attempts at drawing lifelike portraits of my friends or lovers, and I can attest to this idea of centers shaping each other. It was amazing how an eye, being just a millimeter farther apart than the subjects on the paper, or the negative space of the brow being not quite the right shape, would make the portrait appear to be an entirely different person. The subtlest correction of shape and space, and suddenly the subject would just appear. The strength and presence of these centers can bring a space to life where it seemed lost.
I am thrilled with the joy of living and the wonderful feeling of
Over the course of the next 10 years, Alexander developed 15 ways in which centers help each other come to life, which became the 15 fundamental properties. Now, this is where the book and the process becomes fairly technical, and if I were to break down each of these properties, I'd probably lose 90% of you, assuming I have anyone right now. They're fascinating, but granular in their approach and really only of use to those of you who plan to study this work deeply. So if you want to dive in, get the books, check it out. But I will at least mention them. So here we go. The 15 fundamental properties are levels of scale, strong centers, boundaries, alternating repetition, positive space, good shape, local symmetries, deep interlock and ambiguity, contrast, gradients, roughness, echoes, the voice, simplicity and inner calm, and lastly, not-separateness. Now, this last one is worth expounding upon, and he even says himself that it is the most important property of all. Get this. He says that this property of not-separateness states that, quote, any center which has deep life is connected in feeling to what surrounds it. It is not cut off, isolated, or separated. In a center which is deeply coherent, there is a lack of separation, and instead a profound connection between that center and the other centers around it, so that the various centers melt into one another and become inseparable. It is that quality which comes about from each center, to the degree it is connected to the whole world. End quote. Life. Each center expanding out in profound connection with the whole, which in turn becomes a center in profound connection with a greater whole. As above, so below. Follow the golden thread here to the battle of individualism versus the collective here in the US, and we discover what happens when one center tries to dominate other centers. Well, in the human body, they call that cancer. A group of cells stops doing their job and starts spreading uncontrollably, attempting to dominate the body's resources. I mean, sure, we're just talking about architecture here. But are we? Despite this magnum opus on architecture, Alexander himself is deeply illustrating the essence of approaching all abstract disciplines from a unified theory of wholeness on the nature of life itself. After 100 pages of examples of the 15 properties in architecture and man-made spaces, he spends a modest 50 more pages explaining these exact properties found in nature. Levels of scale found in the structure of a cell. The strong center of a milk drop splashing. Levels of scale in the cracks of mud. Centers formed by spirals of an orchid. A boundary around the sun. The alternating structure of a fern leaf. The positive space of soap bubbles. Symmetries of crystal growth and the beryllium atom. the interlocking patterns of a giraffe's coat, the contrast of a purple emerald butterfly, gradients in the foothills of the Himalayas, the roughness of a weather-beaten elder, the eye of a hurricane, the not-separateness at the edge of a pond. I mean, we're talking about distilling down the fundamental higher order properties of the formation of the universe. It's like the golden section, the Fibonacci sequence, only more. How do we build a living structure? Well, observe the natural world, which no one can argue is not living, and replicate its process. Genius? Maybe. Or maybe it's just like, well, duh. These 15 properties came out of 10 years of observation. And he published a few books where he was working it all out. Centers were entities in Alexander's vocabulary for years. And all of this came out of a feeling that the built world was just not nearly as alive as the natural world. And I mean, who could argue that? Now, to Alexander, that wasn't always the case. But certainly in the postmodern neoliberal capitalist paradigm, we are moving efficiently towards death. Alexander is asking us to consider the whole, that is, the entire ecosystem we know as Earth, or what our church calls Gaia, as a living system. He points out that to build things that are outside of the laws of this living system is to begin to stray from natural law. In other words, to build ugly, lifeless shit for the sake of money and efficiency is to stray from natural law. Huh. Go figure. Alexander's concept of wholeness is founded upon the idea that the centers which make up the whole have varying degrees of life. It's also one way of saying that not all nature has the same degrees of life as observed by the observer. It's also one way of saying that various aspects of nature have different values. That there is something called value in the universe, and that value is relative. Feel that Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance vibe coming through? Here we go. Humans are the observers of that relativity. Objective science, a system that attempts to level the playing field of value through objectivity and reductionism into equal parts, often deems placing value on components or outcomes as becoming partial. But as we're about to see, Alexander is begging us to become partial in a new way, to become part of the whole.
You see that thing he did with the words? Yeah. Real witty, boss.
It's human beings and human processes that are degenerating the wholeness of the world. And why? Because we've attempted to separate ourselves from it. And here, like many modern thinkers and artists who see that the fundamental bifurcation of the subject and object, of humans and nature, as a moment in history where things started going wrong, Alexander asks us once again to unify the arts and sciences, the classical and romantic, or as Phaedrus would say, the observer and the observed. The state of samadhi or enlightenment is where our meditation and the object of our meditation become one. Alexander writes, quote, "This revelation can lead to a mental world where art, form, order, and life unite our feeling with our objective sense of reality. In a synthesis which opens the door to a form of living in which we may become truly human. Above all, this is the threshold of a new kind of objectivity." End quote. So we're talking about a merging of the abstract and the real, a study of phenomenology through the subject and accounting for the subject. We mentioned this a little earlier in the episode, but let's dive a little deeper. If you're listening to all this and you feel like you might have to listen to it twice, totally cool. I had to record it twice, so I know how you feel. Okay, everyone in high school at this point has probably heard the most basic explanation of quantum physics, which is that the observer affects the experiment. So why philosophy and science often strive to remove the observer is a mystery to me. And it's a golden thread that can lead us to a deep and abstract conversation about modern philosophy. But for now, let's just say that the nature of order, the science of constructing an environment that is alive, requires a subject to weigh in on the results of that experiment, or in this case, the qualities of aliveness in all things. So what does that mean for something to be subjective or personal? Well, to Alexander, it's not our idiosyncrasies. We're not talking about vanilla or chocolate, Democrat, Republican. We're talking about the feeling nature of our person. How does something make us feel? 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 We're right back in Buhner's metaphysical background of the world of the animist. The personal touches something deep within us and within others. What makes something personal also becomes a center of power in the wholeness of things. Right away, we get a sense of this new kind of objectivity Alexander is referring to. That which touches us personally is often, but not always, a universal quality. But ultimately, what is personal is deeply connected to human feeling. It is connected to wholeness. This wholeness, when experienced, leads to a profound sense of happiness, because our feeling about the world and the world itself are all part of the wholeness. And this upends the mechanistic Cartesian view and once again installs the power of the animist. We are inextricably a part of the world, including our inner experience. When I witness a flock of birds dancing in formation in the sky, when I come face to face with the majesty of a whale breaching the fjord, it feels like a deeply personal experience, as if nature was speaking to me through her movements, expressing her love for me by demonstrating her majesty, in the same way that Mozart or Matisse poured the personal into their work so that I might feel them. This is life. The feeling of life is life. What Alexander refers to as these centers of power in the whole are the places that unite objective life and these personal feelings. These centers of power become portals. Portals where the space they occupy begins to draw in the personal. Portals of synergy, portals of emergence, portals of aliveness, weaving us through time and space, connecting us to all beyond and within, connecting us to creation, to art. You've been in these kinds of spaces, you've experienced these kinds of centers, places where you just feel so much more alive, places that have been built by humans. Machu Picchu, the Great Wall of China, just about any ancient castle in Europe, an old farmhouse, a truly precise and pristine Victorian home, your grandmother's kitchen. This quality is what Alexander is asking us to imbue in that which we build, the built human world, which takes up far more space, mass, and energy than the actual humans. You could say that the built world of humans is far vaster, far bigger, and full of more power centers than the humans themselves. That's part of our power. Matisse did not give the world one drawing. Mozart composed and published over 600 works. A human house in America is roughly 1,000 times more mass than a single human that lives in it. Our built world and its aliveness, its wholeness, it's a part of nature. It's a part of us. It's a reflection of our own aliveness and wholeness. It's a mirror of the self. So how do we imbue life into the whole of our built world? What exactly is the aliveness in these centers that we speak of? How do we start to create this personal yet objective method of making these choices when we build? Ultimately, we're making judgment calls. Well, step one, enjoy it deeply from the heart. Obvious, but then again, not obvious. I have, at least once in my life, lived in an apartment that I couldn't stand at all. I didn't like the common areas, the apartment itself, the neighborhood, any of it. Why did I live there? Well, it was all I could afford. I could say the same about clothes I've bought or things that I've owned. Sometimes the functionality and its necessity in my life dictated that I buy it, but I didn't necessarily like the thing. Say you have this picture of a jacket in your head for a costume you're creating. Say it was just purely imagined by the genius you are, or you saw it, like in Boba Fett or something. And you're like, I gotta find that. Maybe you went on Amazon or Etsy or even some LARPing websites and you saw some things that looked kind of like it, but they just didn't touch the essence of what you had in your mind. Or say you're looking at a car and it's nice, it's comfy, it's got all the new gizmos, but aesthetically, if they would have just pushed out the fenders a little more or increased the stance a few more inches or made these curves a little softer. I have these feelings all the time, especially about cars. But I also have a particular feeling when something in the made world is personally perfect for me. When something touches my heart so deep that there's not an atom I would change to its design. The only painting I've ever bought had that quality. I had no objection to a single thing about it. It was as if my mind had reached out and took the artist's hands as my own. I've had just a few pieces of clothing that fit that description. That fit like they were tailored right on my body. And in every way represented the expression of my being. That they looked like the aliveness that I felt within me. They were me. You ever have that? Think of all the things in the world. How many of them were so precious to you that in a sense, they were you? In contrast, think of how many lifeless things you've owned. Things built purely for function without any lasting durability or aesthetic. Remember Byung-Chul Han's essay, Non-Things? I remember in that essay him talking about how the iPhone was not a thing. It wasn't a thing, and he's absolutely right. There's nothing unique about an iPhone, except maybe the case we put on it. But ultimately, it's disposable, it's planned for obsolescence, and it has no real sense of aliveness to it. Despite how functional and useful it is and how it finds a way to become a part of us. But not in that way, not in the alive way. Kind of more in like the killing your brain sort of way, if you know what I mean. Things can be like people in many ways. The more you know someone, the more they become a part of you. In my own opinion, spending time with some things, getting to know the parts of them we don't fully understand, can lead to the same place. We can come to love all of something deeply and allow its personal aspects to become our own, especially if something's made from the heart. There's a difference between an initial draw or desire and a deep, lasting satisfaction for something. Alexander makes a distinction from just liking something and feeling its aliveness. In fact, in some of his pictorial tests we mentioned earlier, when he asks questions like, what photo represents the essence of you? Sometimes it wasn't the photo that they liked. Sometimes they liked the modern cut angles more than the softer worn edges. But it seems in Alexander's studies that when asked what sense of aliveness or what object more represented them, it didn't always have a distinct quality that was running parallel to what they liked. In these books, he gives hundreds of pictorial examples of one alive thing over another. I didn't agree with every one. He would put a photo of two different rugs on a page, and he would say, which one is more alive? I'd look at one and have a feeling like, oh, that one definitely feels more alive. And apparently 80% of the people who would look at these photos would have the same experience. Now, it's not to say there isn't space for the avant-garde or the experimental. It's all in relation to the whole. But according to Alexander, that empirical figure of his experiment is 80%. 80% of people he interviews, all with different tastes in architecture or design, can all agree on which of the two side-by-side photos are more alive. Try this with a group of friends. Take two similar but unique objects, 2 different glasses, 2 cups, 2 different shoes, and ask 5 different people which one feels more alive. See if the value of these things can be agreed upon. Now, let's take this golden thread a little deeper. What if our recognition of beauty, of aliveness, of self, the feeling of belonging is a universal quality that we can all see together? What if this process of building a living world is the very medicine to our differences? That beyond culture, that beyond our idiosyncrasies, our politics, our opinions, is a true version of ourselves that, well, looks like a true version of everyone else, which in turn shares a deep and vastly alive quality with Gaia herself. That truth is found within. The mirror of the self is the observational method in which we measure what we call life. Let's go back to that quantum thread we mentioned earlier. Quantum physics asks us to confront a reality that is fundamentally different from what our senses tell us. It's the study of the minuscule, the subatomic realm where particles do not behave like solid objects, but instead seem to exist as waves of probability on the edge of existence, dancing in harmony to somehow birth reality. It is here at the foundation of reality that we encounter an idea that shakes the very roots of how we understand the world. The observer changes the experiment.
The principle arises most famously in the double-slit experiment that began quantum mechanics. When particles such as electrons are fired at a screen through 2 slits, they produce an interference pattern, as if they were waves passing through both slits simultaneously and interacting with themselves. However, when scientists place a detector at the slits to observe which slit the particle passes through, the interference patterns disappear. The particles behave as though they are solid, definite objects moving through one slit or another. Observation itself seems to collapse the wave-like behavior of the electron into a fixed particle state. This phenomenon, often referred to as wave function collapse, forces us to reckon with the role of the observer in reality. How can the mere act of observing or measuring change the outcome of an experiment?
Excuse me. Niels Bohr, a founding figure of quantum mechanics, suggests that the act of observation is not a passive activity, but a participatory one. Observation is not separate from reality. It's a part of reality. This flies in the face of classical Cartesian notions of an objective external universe existing independently of the observer. The quantum realm hints that subjectivity, the act of observing, perceiving, participating, is woven into the very fabric of the cosmos. Now, I'm not a physicist.
That's okay, I'm totally a physicist.
Dude, shut up. But there are striking parallels between this quantum revelation and the mysticism of Eastern traditions, such as Taoism, Buddhism, and Hinduism, which have long suggested that reality is not static, It's not an objective construct, but a dynamic interplay of relationship as indefinable and ever-changing. A flow that cannot be grasped by rigid categories. Quantum mechanics, in its dissolution of objective certainty, points to a similar truth. The world is not a machine. It is a dance of energy and relationships, and we are part of that dance. To observe the world is not to stand apart from it, but to participate in its unfolding. Robert Pirsig, the author, explores this very idea in his book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He presents the idea of quality as a kind of ineffable essence that bridges the subjective and the objective. He describes it as the knife edge where perception and reality meet, a phenomenon that is simultaneously within us and out there in the world. Quality is what guides our judgments, our sense of what is good, beautiful, true. It is a thread that ties together the rational, mechanical understanding of the world with the ineffable, artistic intuition of it. His concept of quality, much like the role of the observer in quantum physics, suggests that reality is not a static, objective stage upon which we humans are just spectators. Instead, reality is something we co-create. In Pirsig's view, quality is the basis of all experience. It is what makes an experience meaningful. And in quantum mechanics, the observer is not merely a passive recorder, but an active participant in the very shaping of reality. Both perspectives point to a profound philosophical truth. Subjectivity is not a defect in our perception of the world. It is a feature of reality itself. Phenomenology, the philosophical study of experience as it is lived, also suggests this inseparability of the subject and the objective. Philosophers Husserl, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty in various ways argue that we cannot separate the phenomenon or what we perceive from the constructed world. The world we encounter is always already shaped by the structures of our perception, our intentions, and our consciousness. Yet, this does not mean that the world is purely subjective. If we take the double slit experiment as metaphor, it suggests that reality is fundamentally relational. The electron exists as a wave of possibilities until it interacts with the observer, at which point one possibility crystallizes into actuality. Similarly, quality emerges in the interaction between the observer and the observed. It is not a property of the subject or the object, but a dynamic relationship between the two. This relational view of reality changes the traditional scientific paradigm, which seeks to strip away subjectivity to uncover an objective truth. Then here comes quantum mechanics suggesting that this, quote, truth cannot be separated from the process of observation.
Okay, what the fuck is this guy talking about? Jesus. Well, it's kind of like this, boss, you know. Everybody's trying to say that, one thing or another is true. Like somehow the world out there is like, it doesn't move. It's this thing and it's the same. And we should all be able to look at it and go, hey, that's the color blue, right? But what he's saying is like, no, like we all see different shades of blue and, basically we gotta, like our point of view is important, and science, like we're still looking at the results of everything. There's still a guy involved, you know what I mean? And in his opinion, even he maybe thinks it's fact, but maybe it's not. If another guy comes around and says that's not fact, then then you just got two opinions, right? So you can't really get away from the subjective or just like a personal point of view on the whole thing. I think that's what he's talking about. I'm starting to think I should put you up for a promotion or something. I mean, Jesus Christ, man. What are you, a frickin' savant or something? Nah, boss, none of that now. I just, I'll watch the door for you. I drive the car. I'm okay. I'm good.
Science itself is a deeply subjective enterprise. The theories we construct, the experiments we design, the interpretations we make are all shaped by human perception, creativity, and values. Far from undermining the scientific process, this acknowledgement of subjectivity enriches it. It reminds us that science is not merely a mechanical accumulation of facts, but a human endeavor driven by curiosity, wonder, and the quest for meaning. But this doesn't mean abandoning objectivity, only rethinking it. Objective truths, laws of nature, mathematical equations are real and powerful, but they are always encountered through subjective experience. Our understanding of them is mediated by language, culture, and perception. The observer, then, is not merely an intruder into the natural world, but an integral part of it. And both the observer and the observed ultimately lead us back to the same mystery, that reality is not something we can stand apart from and analyze in isolation. We are in it, shaped by it, shaping it. So whether we are conducting a quantum experiment or repairing a motorcycle, we are participating in the unfolding of the cosmos. In this participation, we discover not only the nature of reality, but also the nature of ourselves. Science, art, philosophy, and spirituality are all ways of exploring this dynamic interplay, this wave function of existence where observer and observed, self and other, subject and object are forever entangled. And I'll be damned if it ain't here in this relational cuddle puddle that meaning arises. It is here that quality lives. And it is here that Alexander would say that quality and aliveness are of the same kin. And though his book at face value is about architecture, the nature of order sets out to broaden our spiritual horizons. Consider the question Alexander poses for his techniques of measuring our relationship to the feeling of two things, and use it to measure our relationship to the feeling of two ideas or two choices. Imagine asking yourself this series of questions I'm about to say for any choice you have to make. In fact, if you have an important choice to make in your life right now, hold this choice or these choices in your heart and see if there are answers to these sorts of questions about your choices. Ask yourself these questions. Which choice seems to generate a greater feeling of life in me? Which choice makes me more aware of my own life? Which choice induces a greater harmony in me, in my mind, and in my body? Which choice makes me feel a great wholesomeness in myself? Considering myself as a whole that embraces all my dimensions and my many internal opposites, which choice is more like my best self? Or which choice seems more like a picture of my eternal self? Which choice makes me feel devotion or inspires devotion in me? Which choice makes me more aware of God or makes me feel closer to God? When I try to observe the expanding and contracting of my humanity, which choice causes a greater expansion of my humanity? Which choice has more feeling in it? Which choice makes me experience a deeper feeling of unity in myself? He likens these questions to the sorts of questions an Aikido practitioner might ask themselves when comparing two actions, or a Buddhist practitioner might ask themselves when taking a precise measurement of the quality of their inner state. He is asking for a world that values self-reflection, which he believes will then reflect the outer world.
So great. Now that we got this down, how do we actually build stuff that's alive and it makes us feel better?
Great question. Glad you asked. Let's take a moment and consider how the built world impacts us. I mean, surely it's not hard to conclude that the built world has an impact on us. It's not hard to see that the built world helps us to move freely through the world, to problem solve, to have social opportunity and mobility. Studies have shown that transportation, for instance, is paramount to escaping poverty. If you ever ride the train in Chicago, it's hard not to want to look at the CTA maps. And traditionally, the more impoverished south and west sides have had far less train access than the north side. Prior to the opening of the Orange Line in 1993 and the Pink Line in 2006, there were nearly 100 square miles of Chicago that didn't have access to trains. There's no question that access to transportation, healthcare, better schools, all affect the freedom of a citizen. Alexander, of course, asks us to look deeper. He wants us to look at the more minute, but impactful stressors of modern architecture, like the lack of public spaces in apartment complex, the stresses of living in high-rise buildings, or neighborhoods where it is difficult to walk safely to a corner store, or neighborhoods where there is no corner store, or places where there are no sidewalks to walk at all. I mean, there's a significant difference in the stress levels when walking along a sidewalk that buffers the street with trees or grass versus being just a few feet from cars driving over 30 miles an hour right past you. In a world built to enhance human life, we experience an ease, a freedom to be ourselves, to engage socially with both humans and nature. Think of the feeling of a room that has but one window looking out onto the street versus a room that has light from multiple angles and looks out over nature. There's a greater freedom experienced just by how light enters a room, or how our vision extends from outside of the room. The functionality of the space is equally important to the aesthetic. Functionality is an aspect of wholeness, and the wholeness of a space, as we've demonstrated, is dependent on the interaction of its centers. So let's go back to that example of the living room. Now, I don't know about you, I've never considered the true function of a living room. A good living room is the space where the family meets, they spend time together, and they just live. We've all probably been to a dozen, if not 100 different living rooms. Some of them just beg to be lived in, to be enjoyed with the company of others or by ourselves. Some invite us to take a nap or read a book, and some are completely uninviting. Maybe they're not centrally located or easy to get to, or maybe the plastic over the couches repels anyone from even sitting on them. Or maybe the kitchen is such a strong center that everybody wants to hang out in the kitchen instead of the living room. To get an idea of these centers we're talking about, Alexander gives us some examples. For instance, a living room. It has a core resting place, a place that invites rest, with comfortable chairs or couches that are not touched by the through traffic of the room. We have to pay attention to the position of the entrances and paths, which can be considered also one or more centers. If there's a constant through traffic in the living room, it can disrupt the desire to live in it. It can cause stress. The spatial volume of the room is a center within itself, where an unusually high or low spatial volume can impact the room. The stuff in the room, or the positive space versus negative space. The most obvious center might be a focal point of attention. In most modern homes, this might be a television. But imagine a fireplace, or a bay window, or that epic oak coffee table we used in the example. The view itself is a center. What is immediately outside the windows? You ever been in a hotel where your window overlooks a beautiful downtown versus a hotel where your window looks at a dumpster in the alley somewhere? This all impacts the desire to be in the room, the sanctity of the room. Interior lighting is a center, not too bright, not too dim, perhaps coming from different places and angles as opposed to one great overhead light. Even the shadows created by the light in the evening must be complementary to the room. When the centers are in harmony, they are less noticed. What is noticed is the flow of energy, the feeling of the room, the aliveness of the room, the feeling of freedom and relaxation within ourselves. And yet, these centers become a spark of life in the fabric of the space. The centers are a place where space and matter come to life, that the animism of the built world comes into being. Alexander calls this the awakening of space. In books 2 and 3, Alexander dives deeper into the study of life, how to define and measure it in a way that allows us to build a living world. And in the last book, book 4, Alexander draws us out of our mechanistic minds, out of rationality as we know it, into the mystic, mythic, unseen, felt living world, where the awakening of space is a catalyst for our own awakening and the awakening of all things. He helps us to see that space as we know it is something far beyond the emptiness we've come to know it as. That space is alive. Well, that's all for today, folks. I know that was a mouthful of esoteric philosophical shenanigans, but trust me, it's worth the mental gymnastics. Chapters of the upcoming books include titles like Encouraging Freedom, Form, Language, and Style, The Uniqueness of the Individual Worlds, Our Belonging to the World, and my personal favorite, Making Wholeness Heals the World. I'm telling you, Christopher Alexander, he's a gangster. He's got the universe figured out. I'm excited to present more, but please let me know if this stuff is interesting to you or not. If I should keep going or move on. Got lots of ideas in the queue. Let me know. Today's show featured edited music from Azira and Coyote, the song Infinite Colors by Tony Moss, the song Inside of Me by Dustin Valentine, the song Alive and Well by Janae Aiko, the song Living World by Spacecraft, and of course excerpts from The Matrix.
There is no spoon.
As always, feel free to ask questions or offer feedback in our forum at infiniteharmony.org, which will include the transcripts of each episode for quotes and references. If you're interested in supporting this podcast or our work, you can become a donating member of the Church of Infinite Harmony. That's us. You can donate any amount you want, once a month or as often as you like. As a nonprofit, this podcast and our organization are supported by your donations. Visit Infinite Harmony and become a monthly member today. We've also got some great fundraisers going on that you can donate to for specific projects. We're in the process of bringing to life the Sacred Waters Project at our sanctuary, which is going to give people the opportunity to interact with the water here on a deep and profound level. And we're doing our best to use as much natural building techniques as possible. All right. It's been fun. See you next time. Peace.